Spider-Man. Brand New Day is reportedly doing numbers that are making the situation around Supergirl look even worse. And now, the people running DC appear to be getting increasingly defensive. The biggest question isn't simply why one superhero movie is succeeding while another is struggling. It's why the explanation for Supergirl's failure keeps shifting. First, it was the critics. Then, it was toxic fandom. Then, misogyny. And now, we're seeing gender itself being brought into the comparison. But if the problem really is that audiences simply don't want female-led superhero movies, then how do you explain Wonder Woman? And more importantly, what happens when audiences prove they're still willing to spend billions on superhero movies, as long as the movie actually gives them a reason to care? That's where this comparison gets very interesting. Before we get into everything, make sure you're subscribed to the Woke Watch, because we're breaking down the latest Hollywood and superhero controversies without wasting your time. Now, let's get into it. The conversation surrounding Supergirl has taken another turn because the movie is now being compared directly with Spider-Man. Brand New Day, and the contrast couldn't be more dramatic. According to the numbers being discussed, Spider-Man has reached approximately $1.7 billion worldwide, putting enormous attention on the performance of other major superhero franchises. And naturally, that comparison has created another uncomfortable conversation for DC. Because if audiences were truly suffering from something called superhero fatigue, then a massive Spider-Man success would be difficult to explain. People clearly aren't tired of superheroes in general. What many audiences appear to be tired of is superhero movies that don't give them what they're looking for. That's an important distinction. A successful superhero movie doesn't necessarily need to reinvent the genre. Sometimes audiences simply want a strong story, characters they actually care about, entertaining action, good dialogue, and a reason to stay invested from beginning to end. And that is exactly where the criticism of Supergirl has been concentrated. Critics and audiences have pointed toward problems involving the screenplay, dialogue, character development, world building, performances, and the overall execution of the story. Meanwhile, the argument surrounding Spider-Man is almost the complete opposite. The movie is being praised by its supporters for keeping the formula accessible, entertaining, and relatively straightforward instead of overwhelming audiences with unnecessary complexity. And that has created an uncomfortable question for DC Studios. If Spider-Man can still attract enormous audiences, is superhero fatigue really the problem? Or is the real problem simply making a superhero movie that people don't want to watch? That's where the reported comments attributed to Warner Bros. CEO David Zaslav become particularly controversial. The argument presented by Zaslav is that comparing Supergirl directly with Spider-Man isn't necessarily fair because they're fundamentally different properties. One is centered around a female superhero, while the other is built around a male character played by Tom Holland. And according to this argument, the current cultural and political environment makes female-led projects more vulnerable to criticism and underperformance. The claim is essentially that misogyny and sexism played a major role in preventing Supergirl from reaching the same level of success. Now, regardless of where you stand on that argument, there's a major problem with using gender as the primary explanation for a movie's performance. Because Hollywood history doesn't support the idea that audiences automatically reject female superhero protagonists. And there's one obvious example that immediately comes to mind: Wonder Woman. The 2017 film starring Gal Gadot became a major commercial and cultural success. Audiences embraced the character. The movie received strong attention from critics and fans. And most importantly, people actually showed up. So if being centered around a woman automatically puts a superhero movie at a massive disadvantage, Wonder Woman becomes a very difficult example to explain away. And that's why critics of the Supergirl argument keep bringing that movie back into the conversation. Even the fact that Wonder Woman 1984 performed far worse doesn't necessarily prove that audiences rejected the character because she was a woman. There were numerous other factors surrounding that sequel, including its story, reception, release circumstances, and overall execution. The larger point is simple. A female superhero can succeed. A male superhero can fail. A female superhero can fail. And a male superhero can become a massive hit. Gender alone doesn't determine whether audiences will connect with a movie. The movie itself still matters, and that's precisely why the Spider-Man comparison has become so uncomfortable for DC. Because if Spider-Man is performing at an extraordinary level at the same time that Supergirl is struggling, the industry has to ask a much harder question. Maybe audiences aren't rejecting superhero movies. Maybe they're rejecting certain superhero movies. That's a very different problem. And if that's the lesson Hollywood takes from these two movies, it could have a major impact on what Marvel, Sony, Disney, and DC decide to make next. Studios could increasingly move toward projects that prioritize entertainment, character development, accessible storytelling, and strong scripts rather than assuming the brand name alone will guarantee success. because audiences have more choices than ever before. They can wait for streaming, they can watch something else, they can spend their money on another movie. And social media makes it incredibly easy for word of mouth to spread within hours. That's why a bad theatrical performance can become much more damaging in today's environment. But the response from the DC side isn't simply about Supergirl, it's also about what's coming next. The argument being presented is that Spider-Man is an exceptional case, and that DC's own major success could still arrive with Man of Tomorrow. That project is being positioned as an important priority for the studio, particularly because of the way it plans to bring together Clark Kent, Kara Zor-El, and the wider Superman family. And there's another interesting detail being discussed here. Kara is expected to have a significant role in that story, potentially one that could put her on a very prominent level within the movie. That makes the performance of Supergirl even more relevant, because audiences are now going to be watching closely to see whether the character can regain momentum through her future appearances. The other major argument being made is that box office numbers don't automatically determine whether a movie is good. And technically, that's true. A movie can make enormous amounts of money and still receive criticism. A smaller movie can perform modestly and still develop a passionate fan base. But the reverse argument is also important. You can't simply dismiss box office results whenever they're inconvenient. A theatrical performance is still one of the clearest indicators of how many people were willing to spend money to see a movie during its initial release. And that's why the Supergirl conversation continues even after its theatrical run. The movie has moved into the digital market, and attention is now shifting toward how it performs outside theaters. The argument is that audiences should give the movie another opportunity through digital platforms and eventually streaming. But there is an obvious obstacle. Digital rentals and purchases cost real money. If someone has already decided they weren't interested enough to watch Supergirl in theaters, convincing that same person to spend additional money renting or buying it digitally is not necessarily an easy task. Streaming is different. Once the movie becomes available through a service people already subscribe to, the barrier becomes much lower. Someone can simply press play, watch for 20 minutes, decide they don't like it, and move on. They haven't had to buy another ticket. They haven't had to pay a separate rental fee. And that means streaming could potentially give Supergirl a much larger casual audience than digital sales. The timing of that streaming release therefore matters. If Warner Brothers decides to move the movie onto its streaming platform sooner than originally expected, people will inevitably interpret that decision in different ways. The studio can call it part of a normal distribution strategy. Critics can call it an attempt to get the movie in front of as many viewers as possible after a disappointing theatrical run. Both interpretations are going to exist, but one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The Supergirl debate is no longer simply about one movie. It's becoming a test of how Hollywood responds when audiences reject a major project. Do studios listen to the criticism? Do they change their approach? Do they blame external factors? Or do they simply insist that the audience misunderstood what they were trying to accomplish? Because that's ultimately what makes the Spider-Man comparison so important. If Spider-Man continues succeeding while other superhero projects struggle, the industry can't simply conclude that superheroes are finished. The evidence doesn't support that. Instead, studios may have to accept a much simpler lesson. People will still show up for superhero movies when the movie gives them a reason to show up. The brand can get someone through the theater doors once. But the story, characters, and entertainment value are what convince them to stay. And that's exactly why the future of DC is going to be fascinating to watch. If Man of Tomorrow succeeds, the conversation around Supergirl could eventually become a forgotten chapter. But if another major DC project struggles, then questions about the studio's creative direction are going to become much harder to ignore. For now, the battle is essentially between two competing explanations. One side says Supergirl was hurt by misogyny, toxic fandom, and an unfair media environment. The other side says audiences simply didn't connect with the movie itself. And somewhere between those two arguments is the answer that DC will eventually have to confront. Because at the end of the day, audiences don't owe any studio a ticket. They don't owe a franchise a positive review. And they certainly don't owe a movie success simply because the studio believes in it. The audience gets to decide. So now the question is, was Supergirl really a victim of superhero fatigue and misogyny? Or did Spider-Man simply prove that audiences are still hungry for great superhero entertainment? That's the conversation Hollywood should be having. And whatever happens next with Man of Tomorrow could give us a much clearer answer.